Hi, it's been a minute since my last upload, hasn't it? This is going to be a simpler video in terms of the editing, so feel free to just listen along. While I was on my way back from picking up a few things, I was momentarily distracted by crippling existential crises, and I also think I may have lost my mind. Someone then took the opportunity to swap my milk for one that has some fun extra colors and textures in it. Regardless, there is milk in the fridge now, as I am back. And would you believe it if I said that this was my third time recording this script? Lucky for me, the game group that I play tabletop RPGs with has been more consistent than my upload schedule, and has kept me somewhat sane in these trying times. As a group, we've recently reached the bottom of the RPG iceberg, where we've transcended playing traditional D&D adjacent systems in favor of homebrew games that were hastily concocted over a weekend. In these games, we often find ourselves neglecting the actual pen and paper aspect for sessions at a time, as we have a bad habit of miraculously avoiding combat scenarios. But to my surprise, this hasn't really hindered us in any way. If anything, keeping our attention focused on the game has improved our overall level of roleplay from each of us at the table, and it's got me thinking about this video's topic, which is something that I often think about. That topic being the tendency for tabletop players, both new and old, to overly rely on their character sheet to describe their character. Stop me if you've heard this before, but you've likely encountered someone describing their character as being fairly attractive, only for someone else to ask what their charisma score is. Oh, an 18 you say. Well, that is indeed one hot mama. You've likely also seen the opposite happen, where a character with a strength or intelligence of 9 is described as being fairly weak or stupid, regardless of whether or not those characters are trained in athletics or the various knowledge skills. This is the problem I want to bend your ear talking about, and for the record, this is not something that's exclusive to Dungeons & Dragons, although I would say it's probably the worst offender in terms of its core presentation negatively affecting roleplay. It's not just the numbers either, but a slew of smaller problems from the gameplay and rules side of tabletop, creating a sort of dissonance between the players, their characters, and the world they are attempting to immerse themselves in. My argument is that you shouldn't treat your character sheet as the unbending word of God. Same thing with stat blocks if you're a dungeon master, because at the end of the day, both are just tools to help you run the game, and they don't necessarily intersect with the collaborative story being told at your table. But what are these problems I'm describing? Let's get into them. So, because 5th edition is still Mr. Popular, and I assume most people clicking on this video have seen its character sheet at least once, I'm going to use it as my example to break down the things that I have a problem with. It's a good character sheet, don't get me wrong, with all the relevant information being clear and visible, and now watch me tear it to shreds. Really quickly here, I have marked out the problem areas as I see them, and no, I'm not going to talk about all of them. The stuff highlighted in green are things that I have no problem with, such as your character's physical description, their backgrounds, their ideals and so on, and their backstory. This stuff is objectively useful, as if you were to read it out loud to the other players, it would give them a good idea of who your character is, how they tend to solve problems, what their flaws are as a character, etc. This is the stuff you should be thinking about when you are getting into character. The stuff in the mustard, or heavens forbid, the ketchup, are things that you really shouldn't be thinking about unless you are forced to, lest you get dragged kicking and screaming back into the fart-smelling basement of your actual existence. Yeah, we'll keep that in. Okay, so I'm going to break up my points into 3 sections and try to make them as concise and easy to digest as possible. And I'm also going to fail miserably, so I hope you're ready. Alright, let's get started. Section 1. Don't read too much into numbers, names, and the descriptions of things. Let's really quickly go over the problem I talked about before with trying to ascribe some meaning to your stats and attributes. Now, you might think I'm crazy. Sean, my character has an intellect of 20 or whatever, so clearly he's a genius. And yeah, that might be the case, but I really hope you have something else going on with that character. Because what happens when your 20 intellect genius manages to roll less on a knowledge check than the 10 intelligence bard who picked their skills at complete random because they've never played before? Doesn't feel so good, does it? This moment will likely continue to take you out of the game, as that same bard goes on to prove that the only thing that was stopping them from being a criminal was the lack of opportunity, as they used the money pickpocketed from the party to tip a serving girl they charmed using magic shortly before burning the bard down. DM willing, that character will mysteriously disappear by the start of your next session. But this example hopefully highlights why it's dangerous to make your highest or even your lowest rolled attributes a part of your character's identity. If you set your character up to be unmatched in one field, it doesn't mean that things are going to pan out that way, because you are not the only person playing, and the Dungeon Master decides where and when to roll the dice. The numbers on your character sheet only serve to determine success or failure in terms of storytelling, and in most D20 systems, more often than any other, you are at the complete mercy of the dice. Even if you put 20 into strength, if you roll extremely low, then your giant hulk of a character may fail to kick a door off of its hinges, regardless of how much that wounds your perception of your character. This problem is one of the largest challenges you have to overcome when playing a game that uses hard rules to determine an outcome, as opposed to a rules-light system where actions and consequences are often more free-flowing and forgiving. One way a dungeon master can help to circumvent this problem is to describe failure in such a way that softens the blame being placed upon a character. Maybe you couldn't kick the door down because there was a magical locking spell placed upon it, or the person you are pursuing barricaded the other side with furniture, and now some other method may be required to get past the door, which should make it a little less likely that your companions will point and laugh at you for shattering your tarsals and metatarsals because you simply kicked the door wrong. Those are the bones in your feet, by the way. I already knew that and didn't have to Google it. I'll note here that the opposite situation can also be a problem. If your quote-unquote socially inept character with a charisma of 9 manages to roll a natural 20 when trying to convince an angry mob not to murder them in their party, then they may miraculously succeed, even if you can't picture your character competently stringing 2 words together, like myself. You can guard yourself against situations that cause this cognitive dissonance by simply rounding your characters out and making them a little more believable. Someone who has room to grow and improve as you keep playing. Like in the example before, you shouldn't avoid rolling persuasion just because you have a high chance of failure, because if you succeed despite the odds, then it's all the more satisfying, and you can even use that moment as a jumping off point to explore your character wanting to try to become more outspoken. And if you fail, like when you tried to kick that door down, well, that just means that your character is human, or elf, or goblin, or whatever, and that your character can't solve every problem with overwhelming strength, and maybe should rely on their allies from time to time. Now, I understand why people like to look at the character sheet this way, especially newer players who are still learning the game. When you first see a list that includes strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, it seems to paint a whole picture of what a person is, as the game makers have essentially codified everything that they could think of that a character could feasibly do so that they can make rules around it. Almost every game has these stats, although the names are sometimes different, like using agility instead of dexterity, or fellowship instead of charisma, and sometimes perception gets to be its own stat. At first glance, this seems like a complete list. However, there is actually quite a bit of ambiguity as to how these words can be interpreted, especially when you have to pick just one of these stats to represent a skill roll. A fairly goofy example of this can be seen in old D&D based systems like Pathfinder, which uses intellect to cover all of crafting, or better than that, wisdom to cover every profession. This, of course, means that a shirtless hermit who takes showers under a waterfall is equally overqualified to be a sailor, a coal miner, or a lawyer. Also, I don't see the need for intellect to craft a spoon. I am not reinventing the spoon, so why not use dexterity to show you that I'm good at making things with my hands? You can find examples like this all over the place, but I'm not going to dissect every single stat and make this video hideously boring, or boringer. So instead, I'll just talk about the attribute that I think is mishandled the most, that being charisma. I could do an entire video talking about how Dungeon Masters treat charisma-based skills weirdly different than the rest, but I guess I'll spare you for now. So there has been this persistent misconception with charisma that it is somehow tied to your character's attractiveness when it really isn't true for most games. This idea likely stems from the Warhammer 40k games and the older systems where the fellowship stat is directly tied to things like whether or not your character has horrifying scars littering their face, or if they are a creepy alien that the Imperium teaches their children to kill on sight. This idea should probably stay in those games, because those games actually have rules to support it. More importantly, they don't tie fellowship to your intimidation skill like charisma often is in fantasy games. Because how silly would it be if having terrifying, disfiguring scars somehow made you less intimidating? No, what they do instead for intimidation is something that I'd actually encourage DMs to try and incorporate into other systems, making the attribute you associate with that skill dependent on the situation. If you want to use your character's physically imposing nature to intimidate someone, then you can roll strength, contested by their willpower. But perhaps if you knew something about that person's past, something that you could leverage against them, like saying that you know where their family is and you can go after them, you can use intelligence to make that intimidation check instead. As a player, I appreciate this concept because it makes it feel like I can tackle problems the way that my character would. And as a dungeon master, I would be okay stretching this as far as allowing my players to swap out the primary stat that their class uses, like letting a sorcerer use wisdom for spellcasting instead of charisma. I've personally never been a fan of the idea of these goofy, eccentric not wizards who occasionally burp up pink bubbles and lose all of their hair being the charismatic face of the party. I mean, they can be, I guess, if you can work it into your character's backstory, but I don't think that people who want to play the sorcerer should be pigeonholed into taking the charisma-based skills, given their already limited number of skills to choose from. In general, I think that players should be allowed this level of customization when it comes to creating all aspects of their character. The rules are really just guidelines. You can't really expect the game developers to have thought up of every single scenario that you and your game group are likely to get into. And that's why it's common for dungeon masters to homebrew their own rules to make up for what they think is missing. In a similar example, if you are upset that the player's handbook is missing your favorite weapon, per se, there's nothing really stopping you from asking your dungeon master to take a similar weapon, like a glaive, and say, make it a scythe instead. It's not my first choice, but whatever. I get it. If you want even more flavor, you could describe something like the club your character starts with as a telescopic baton that they created themselves because they're an inventor. Or you could say that the spear that your druid is using is actually a large sewing needle, because your character is an 8-inch tall fairy that zips around stabbing dragons in the eye with household items, because I find that funny. Spells can also benefit from this customization treatment, seeing as how many of them are shockingly vague with the descriptions of what these spells are actually meant to look like, while others are weirdly specific and may not lend itself visually to the character that you are thinking of playing. I once played a half-elf warlock who, in typical fashion, resented his elven parent, but still benefited from having been raised around elves, so he knew how to shoot a bow at a young age. I used the longbow as his improved pact weapon, making it his spell focus, and because he had the Warcaster feat, he also didn't need to use his hands to cast spells. And so, because it made no real difference in gameplay, I described the way that he would cast the Eldritch Blast cantrip as him summoning these smoking red spectral arrows that he could draw from an empty bow, and the more that he leveled up, the more of these arrows that he could conjure and shoot simultaneously, which I think is neat because it implies that my character was getting both better as an archer and as a spellcaster. And with that little anecdote, I'll wrap that section up there. Don't limit your creativity based on descriptions that are arbitrary. And speaking of things that are arbitrary, that brings me neatly to my next point, which is... Number 2. Your character's class is irrelevant to their character. This is probably my biggest gripe with anything that is featured on the character sheet. Even more so than the loathsome alignment system, it's whatever class you wrote down in this box. Like I said, I know the game makers had to come up with a name for each of the classes to theme the abilities around, and so that you can keep track of whatever your character's level is for progression's sake. But please, do not call your character a rogue or a wizard or, for the love of God, a fighter in-game. I see these names sneakily affecting players more often than I don't now when I join random games, where the barbarian player will talk about the barbarian tribe that he comes from, or the druid will describe their druid's circle. And yes, I will concede that everyone's favorite character, Dritz Do'Urden, is a drow ranger. But that isn't meant to imply that he's a graduate from the famous ranger school. It's to make you think about badass characters like Aragorn, who inspired that character archetype to begin with. His character sheet in the later versions even dump his ranger levels in favor of fighter, which makes sense given that he has a trained background in swordsmanship, but we still gotta call him a ranger because that's what he looks like. My problem is that the name of your class is not terribly descriptive outside of vaguely giving an idea of what your character's role is in the party in a metagame sense. And even then it's not really accurate, and it doesn't take into account your feats, your background, other class levels you have taken or are planning to take, and your general playstyle. At worst, an experienced player will hear someone say wizard, and they will immediately think of things like the Fireball and Fly spell because the party is at level 5, and a wizard would be stupid not to prepare the best spells that are available to them, as if learning magic in your setting is as simple as picking it off of a list, because technically it is. Allow me to build on this example. The only thing that all wizards have in common is that they can use magic, right? So having the DM describe a character that you see in a tavern as a wizard doesn't really help you much in determining what kind of magic this person specializes in, or if, more interestingly, they have a tendency to fight up close, maybe even preferring to use a melee weapon and instead only using their magic to enhance their martial fighting capability. If you could look at this character's stat block, you might see that they have some levels invested into fighter, or they could be some kind of homebrew archetype that lets them get away with this build. However, these things really don't affect your participation in the tavern scene that is hopefully being constructed in your head. So, unless every wizard in your setting all went to a similar school and wear a ubiquitous wizard's uniform, such as a pointy hat with a staff and a bathrobe, presumably decorated with stars, it's probably best to not constantly remind the players at the table that they are playing an RPG. And I know it's hard, sometimes you have to talk about your spell levels or whatever, but that shouldn't be happening in character. It's just a little lame, isn't it? Like, imagine you come across a magical trap, and you fail to disarm it, so your NPC companion turns to you and says, "This trap was well made. It looks like we're gonna have to use a Dispel magic at the 5th level." This problem affects DMs and players. Neither should be describing characters in game terms. So, instead of saying you see a human wizard in the corner of the bar sitting by himself, you could instead say, you see a noteworthy individual sitting alone at a table in the far corner. A human man dressed in dark, barely worn traveling clothes that gives you the impression of someone attempting to fit in with the other bar patrons. At his side, you are just able to see a number of vials filled with different colored liquids attached to his belt, as well as some smaller pouches that look just large enough to store other alchemical components. But what stands out the most about him is the jeweled sword he keeps leaned against the table, still in its sheath, a single visible runic letter engraved onto the portion of the blade closest to the hilt. Magic, you assume. This is probably a bit much, but it at least paints a better picture, right? And it serves the purpose of providing a few hints as to the character himself, that he is out of place among the locals, and that he is more than he appears than on the surface, and maybe is on the run from something. He likely uses some kind of magic in combination with that sword you saw, and there's probably a bunch of less obvious things that you could assume about him. Maybe the reason they are in this establishment is because they are looking for capable adventurers who frequent this bar, and they have taken precautions to protect themselves while also trying and failing not to bring attention to himself. Maybe he has the look of somebody who could pay really well for your adventuring group services. Why not? I harp on this point in particular because I'm somebody who likes to write and build worlds, and the last impression I want to give one of my players is that the world that they are participating in is poorly thought out and disappointingly small. In reality, that world is probably disappointingly small, but I'm going to make it seem as large as possible by not limiting myself and my setting to a handful of tropes. If one of my players tells me that they want to play a warlock for one of my upcoming games, I may ask them something like, how did this character come about their powers? Is it a mystery? Was it something that they were born with? Was there a curse that was thrust upon them and must be removed by a certain time or else they'll die? They don't need to have a warlock patron exactly as it is described in the book, where a devil prince or a giga demon, insert evil entity, is sponsoring them with powers. They can have that if the player likes that idea, but I'm not going to funnel them into that one storytelling concept. And if a warlock NPC shows up in my game, you can be damn sure that the origin of their power is going to be weird and incredibly specific. And they probably won't call themselves a warlock. They'll be a spiritualist or a demon summoner. Or you can just call him John, like whatever his name is. He doesn't gotta call himself anything. He's just like a guy, with weird powers. You know what I'm saying? Your goal should be to always maintain a suspension of disbelief. And if you describe things in unique ways, using vocabulary that wasn't spoon-fed to you by the player's handbook, it helps to build an illusion of depth in your game, and it makes it seem as though the details of your world are well thought out, even if you're just pulling it out of your ass at that exact moment. This isn't just a trick. You aren't conning your players into believing something that isn't there. It's just a better way of describing things, which people will naturally become more invested in, as they feel as though their unique characters can be a part of this unfolding landscape. I will say, a good counterpoint to this argument would be that depending on what setting you are playing in, such as the Forgotten Realms for example, the term wizard or ranger might actually reference something specific that has been established in writing. That's fine, honestly, but I still feel like these references will cheapen the experience of the game for the players at your table who may not have decades of fantasy novels behind them to give them the context of those terms. They're just gonna hear words like wizard and think Gandalf, and that's not their fault. Of course, the objective of your game could be to try and have your players fit themselves into characters that are archetypical for that setting. And that can be interesting, especially if you've done the legwork to create your own interesting factions and whatnot. This does mean, however, that your players are going to have to do a bit of extra homework though, and I find that it works best if you are picking a game that is already lore-rich with its setting, like the Warhammer 40k games. If your class name reads something similar to Ship Captain or Head of Security, then I think that those are a bit more self-explanatory and don't really need this level of dissection like I'm giving. Alright, I think we're done that section. My voice is already cracking, but we still have one more part left. And oh boy, I'm gonna be complaining about numbers again. Number 3, trying to visualize hit points and armor class is dumb and a big waste of time. So if that last part represented the thing that bothered me the most when it comes to the character sheet, then this part represents the biggest problem that affects the most number of people, whether they realize it or not. Allow me to set the stage here. There is an evil wizard, yes, it's a wizard again, who has been terrorizing the countryside in an attempt to destabilize the kingdom of who cares. Your party catches wind of this and follows the wizard's path of destruction in order to confront them for their evil deeds. You make it just in time to see the evil wizard hovering evilly above a poor farmhouse, and you watch him rear back and unleash a deadly fireball, exploding the house and vaporizing everyone inside instantly. You engage the wizard in combat, and as he gets to go first, he uses yet another fireball on your party that has yet to move, bathing all of you in a similar explosion that deals 24 points of fire damage. The smoke clears and your party is still standing, feeling relatively good compared to the Charple family in that farmhouse. So, what happened here? Did the wizard get tired from killing too many peasants, causing his power level to drop off? Or are plot-relevant characters simply more fire retardant than your average farmhand? As a D&D veteran, you fully understand what happened numerically. An ordinary person in the Forgotten Realms, trademark, is not intended to be a challenge to characters that can throw around fireballs like it was their only reason for becoming a wizard. Even if a fireball miraculously rolls a 1 on every die, it would still be enough to drop a commoner who makes his saving throw down to 0 hit points. So, the answer to the question, how many peasants can you kill with one fireball, becomes however many peasants you can fit onto the grid. The answer is 52. Obviously, if you look at the numbers this way, it creates a huge problem when trying to visualize high-level combat. That's because we, the players, are creatures made out of meat, and we know that there aren't large numbers of our species who will crumple over at a stiff breeze. And yet, in a metagame sense, we see this manifested, and it sort of underlines the problem of having a huge power scale in your game system, and why this primarily affects epic fantasy. The gulf of difference in hit points between an experienced adventurer and a fucking brown bear is so ludicrous that the same wizard who was chucking fireballs earlier could kill a functionally infinite number of grizzly bears before he could ever pose a threat to the guy who took a seat at the back of the tavern. Meanwhile, on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have nondescript owls posing a serious threat to ordinary people, let alone children who, by this logic, would presumably have to be much weaker than an adult. So, how do we fix this? There are two conventional ways you can avoid this problem. One is to have the Dungeon Master describe things in a way that is more immersive so that people aren't thinking about combat like it's a video game. Your Dungeon Master could have described the previous example with the farmer's family being a result of the house itself catching on fire and the roof collapsing before anyone could escape, making that scenario a little more dangerous and realistic than just the results of a dice roll. And if we're being real, your Dungeon Master wouldn't use a commoner stat block in a scenario like that, as the purpose of that setup would be for the narrative, trying to establish the wizard as an evil villain and a threat to the party. When your party members got hit by that fireball in combat, the reason it didn't instantly incinerate them is because the wizard isn't catching your party unaware. They were out in the open, and even if the players failed their saving throw and took the full damage, the Dungeon Master could have described it as the characters attempting to cover themselves from the blast, albeit still taking a considerable amount of damage simply due to how dangerous that kind of destructive magic is. The second solution is to avoid these scenarios from popping up at all, by having the players encounter threats that scale with their character's level, but not necessarily in power, again, narratively speaking, which admittedly does create its own problems. Essentially, at earlier levels, your dubious party of murder hobos may get into a run-in with the local town guard, who, at levels 1 to 2, may only have light armor and simple weapons. However, a similar scenario at a higher level might take place in a populated city that is famous for using mercenaries to protect itself from the large monsters that live in the area, meaning an encounter with the local guard here might mean running into a more unorthodox group of characters, who might even carry magical equipment on them considering that they work for themselves. Now, is it a little hammy that your party just so happens to bump into scenarios that are perfectly crafted to pose a challenge for them? Yes it is, and your suspension of disbelief is just going to have to tank that hit. The fact of the matter is, if your party can get away with anything because they are just too damn powerful, then the story you are telling is quickly going to stagnate and your character's individual actions will begin to feel meaningless, which will eventually kill your game. However, having characters fight monsters of increasing strength and threat level is almost just as bad, and this almost universally gets to the point where your little group of adventurers are able to embarrass the foundational gods of the universe in combat, despite them only having been on an adventure for a few months at best. so it may be preferable to just have them continue to fight some grounded and realistic combat scenarios from time to time, so that your DM's world doesn't implode in on itself. Armor class. No, I didn't forget about it. It has a similar problem to hit points in that it's begging for a better description. As a number and a gameplay mechanic, AC simply dictates whether an attack hits or not. And if that's all you're thinking about, then combat essentially boils down to 2 HP sponges standing within 5 feet and wailing at each other, trading monstrously lethal blows and occasionally swinging wildly over each other's heads for some reason. Armor class is not a great name in my opinion, as there are a lot of factors that go into determining that number. Your dexterity, whether or not you use a shield, and for some classes, stats like wisdom or constitution come into play, as well as spells like mage armor. Each of these modifiers imply a different method for your character to avoid being hit, not the least of which is the flat number armor itself provides. Interesting combat is grounded in realism. I believe this wholly, so I tend not to imagine combat like I am watching Dark Souls gameplay. If a monster fails to hit your character, it shouldn't be treated as them incompetently missing their swing, unless maybe it was a natural one that was rolled. Instead, it should be described as your character raising their shield just in time to block an incoming sword, or expertly ducking under a wide swing. Or your character turns their body in such a way that causes an arrow to glance off of their armor, or a semi-invisible barrier pushes the attack out of the way in the case of mage armor. You are likely still going to run into problems just because of how these games tend to play out. Like in the scenario where a fully plate armored individual is critically wounded by a dog's bite attack. You know, nipping at his steel ankles. Maybe the straps on his armor came off right as the dog went to bite. Or you could just play a system where armor reduces incoming damage by a flat amount. That could work too. I've got one final grumble in this section concerning larger monsters. I think an easy trap to fall into when describing a battle against something huge like a dragon is to essentially have the damage going out on both sides be mostly superficial until someone's hit points are reduced to 0, or one of the characters lands a killing blow on that monster. You know how it is. You get into the second round of combat when the dragon critically hits someone, and then all of a sudden that person gets completely crushed underfoot, or smashed into the dirt by the dragon's tail swipe. Then on turn 3, someone lands the final hit on the dragon, and regardless of the damage output, that person will go on to describe how they jump onto its back, run up its spine, and then decapitates it. I guess this is better than having no description at all, but if you get lazy in the middle of combat and you only describe in words the final hits that are going out, your combat will probably start to look a little silly, especially if you're the type of game group that likes to think of initiative rounds as being 6 seconds each. Things immediately devolve into a bull in the china shop style scenario where everything just happens all at once. A cartoon smoke cloud goes up, a couple of people get flattened, and then somebody cuts the bad guy's head off, sort of nullifying all of the efforts of the rest of the party and making them look a little stupid in hindsight. You should have just cut the dragon's head off from the start, stupid. Anyways, I think that's everything that I wanted to complain about. Whew, don't I feel better. In a perfect world, I would have loved to talk about some of my favorite well-designed character sheets from various games, and I may do something like that in the future, but for now, I think I'm just going to be focusing on some easier to produce content until I can get back into the swing of things, and let's be real, it's much easier to complain about something than it is to be actually constructive. If you thought this video sucked ass, then feel free to let me know in the comments. If not, then hopefully I will see you in whatever unrelated video I make next. Alright, bye bye for now. I love you.